Hey guys, I'm Ted and I'm here to give you another lecture, and for today's lecture we are finally going to crack into the action. We're going to get to the opening stages of the Civil War, of the United States Civil War, the opening battles, and we're also going to look at how the border state situation was resolved within the United States. But before sorry about that. But before we begin our lecture proper, I just like to do our customary recap and touch bases on what we last discussed. So in our last lectures, our last two lectures, we were looking at the evaluation between the United States on one hand and the Confederate States on the other, with the perceived advantages in terms of population, geography, leadership, and more importantly, the role that foreign observers would play in the upcoming struggle. We saw that the United States did hold a significant advantage in terms of population, but not one that was overly damaging or decisive against the Confederate States. We saw that the Confederates had an advantage in terms of geography. They were able to use the geography to their advantage, their large size, with rivers playing a very important role in the development, in the course of the action of the United States Civil War. We also saw that in terms of economics, economic capacity and leadership, particularly military leadership, the two nations were roughly even, with the North's overwhelming industrial capacity offset by the Confederate States' overwhelming agrarian capacity, and more importantly, by that cotton production, by their ability to marshal slave labor and put those slaves to work. It's not very bad when you say it, but their ability to harness the forced labor of the slaves to fuel their economy offset the North's overwhelming population advantage by allowing them to send a disproportionate amount of men into military service, while keeping their economy running at a fast rate, at a high rate. It also meant that their products, their overwhelmingly popular agrarian products, tobacco, sugar, cotton, found eager markets outside of the continental United States. They were roughly even when we evaluate military leaders, with Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant headlining a mid-19th century slew of American all-stars. In terms of political leadership, Abraham Lincoln gets the advantage, as always seems to get the advantage over Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis initially was very strong, but did not really adapt, did not really make the compromise, did not really make the decisions that enabled him to be a very effective wartime leader. He made considerable enemies who just found it easier to not work with him. Whereas Lincoln was noted for reaching across the aisles and striking compromises and deals with his political opponents, and also dealing with very temperamental general officers, namely George B. McClellan. And now, to begin with, let me just state that 11 slave states had left the United States and succeeded joining the Confederate States. 4 of the border states, 4 slave states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, had not succeeded by August of 1861. Both sides attempted to apply diplomatic pressure and measures to gain their support. These states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, contained large populations, and in the case of Delaware, considerable rail lines and infrastructure, as well as the rest of the states. To begin with our lectures, I just want to run through the border states one by one to state what happened to them in the middle stages, the middle season of 1861. So Kentucky was the most conflicted and the most important strategically, because the Ohio River functions as the northern boundary of Kentucky. Kentucky also had considerable cultural and economic ties to the South, We must never forget that Kentucky was the original western frontier of Virginia. The Kentucky district was the western extreme, the western, if you want to look at it like a third, the western third of Virginia. Kentuckians, Kentucky as a whole, though, had stronger economic ties to the United States. It had stronger ties to the states on its northern border and ultimately chose not to secede. Some Kentuckians fought for the Confederate States, but many more fought for the United States. And to really just underscore for you how divisive this topic was in Kentucky, of Henry Clay's grandsons, 3 fought for the United States, 4 fought for the Confederate States. Henry Clay's grandsons fought for both sides. That's how divisive it was. You had cousin fighting cousin in this case. And Missouri. Missouri was the site of a number of skirmishes between pro and anti-secessionist forces, with the anti-secessionist forces winning out and Missouri remaining in the United States. Now, Missouri also sent troops to both sides, and indeed, of all the border states would send soldiers into both sides. Missouri was also the scene of a bloody guerrilla war that raged for much of the early United States Civil War until United States military personnel moved in and put down all of this sort of reprisal fighting. William Quantrill, Bloody Bill Anderson, and Jesse James are among the more notable participants of the guerrilla war, of the bloody mini Civil War that took place in Missouri. Maryland. Maryland was a very special case for the United States. The District of Columbia, as I've noted in previous videos, the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., is sandwiched in between Virginia and Maryland. If Maryland seceded from the United States capital would lay in hostile territory. This spurred Lincoln to very uncharacteristically take direct action. He placed federal troops in hotspots in Maryland to ensure good behavior. He prevented pro-secession men from voting and had 19 pro-secession legislators arrested. Maryland, as a result, remained in the United States, and like Kentucky and Missouri, sent men to both the Confederate States Army and the United States Army. Roughly 20,000 men, Maryland men, fought in the Confederate States Army, and 40,000 served in the United States Army. And Delaware was the least significant slave state in the United States, and I don't mean that in a disrespectful term. In terms of, really leaving the United States, there was never really a thought. There were Delawareans who fought for the Confederate States, but many more fought for the United States. About 12,000 fought for the United States, and maybe between 800 and 1,500 fought for the United States. Delaware's loyalty was never in doubt. There was a very minuscule slave population in Delaware by 1861. Delaware had always been economically oriented toward Pennsylvania. We must always remember that William Penn is the founder of both Pennsylvania and Delaware. Delaware was originally a part of Pennsylvania. The reason that Delaware got its name was because it was originally referred to as the lower counties on the Delaware, and it's really quite striking too, because there weren't 13 colonies that rebelled against Great Britain. This is something that I should have brought up in our discussion on the American colonies. There were not 13 colonies, but 12 colonies. Delaware was a district of Pennsylvania. Much the same way Maine was a district of Massachusetts before its admission into the Union. So yeah, but also to underscore, slavery. When Pennsylvania was abolishing slavery, Delaware refused to do so, and that was one of the reasons for the split between Pennsylvania and Delaware. Delaware choosing to retain slaves, while Pennsylvania wanted to abolish slaves. And also a fifth. Those were the border states, the slave states, the border slave states at the beginning of the war. But a fifth border state was created in the midst of the war, and that will be West Virginia. Virginia's trans-Allegheny counties. Those counties in the that bordered Ohio and Pennsylvania, those counties had long been at odds with the slave power counties and the rest of Virginia, and they opted to leave the state of Virginia. They have voted against secession, and when the United States Army began to move into the area, they simply jumped on board with the United States Army, held their own. They declared themselves to be the legitimate government of the state of Virginia, and then voted to leave the state of Virginia and enter the United States as the state of West Virginia. And in doing so, they actually took more county. They actually took a larger area than was actually willing to go with them. About 50 states, 50 counties, I'm sorry, in all chose to leave Virginia. Were included in the state of West Virginia. Maybe 11 to like 12, maybe 13 of them would have opted to stay in the state of Virginia rather than go with West Virginia. But those trans-Allegheny counties moved out, pushed out on their own, and in the middle of the war, and entered the Union as West Virginia. And as noted, these counties were economically and socially tied to Pennsylvania and Ohio, and West Virginia sent 25,000 men to the United States Army and 15,000 men to the Confederate States Army. And that's the way, and that's how the cookie crumbled. That's how the border state situation was resolved within the United States. The four border states chose that remained in the Union also remained as slave states. This would be problematic for Abraham Lincoln and the other Republican politicians later on in the war. It impacted Lincoln's decision to move slowly and cautiously because he did not want to alienate them. He feared alienating them the way he had alienated the Virginian, North Carolinian, Tennessean, and Arkansas elite. Arkansan elite. Is it Arkansan? I'm not sure. But he did not want to alienate them, so he proceeded cautiously therein and thereout in moves that regarded them. Now, with that said, let's get down to the actual meat and potatoes of combat between the United States and the Confederate States. Now, both sides made moves to conduct campaigns to protect their capitals, Washington for the United States and Richmond for the Confederate States. And just to underscore for people who don't know, Washington and Richmond are only 100 miles apart. Very, very short distance. Very, very, very close proximity for the two national capitals. The Confederate States, as noted earlier, had only to defend and counteract what the United States military did. And now the United States military had the more daunting, the more difficult task of launching an invasion to bring the Confederate States to heel. Now, Winfield Scott, the hero of the Veracruz campaign, the victor of Mexico City, and an overall hero of the Mexican War, he was the sitting general-in-chief of the United States Army in 1861. He was in his mid-70s. And was really, not there physically, but still there mentally. At the outbreak of the war, he came up with a plan for victory dubbed the Anaconda Plan. And the plan was named after the South American snake. He came up with the plan that entailed pushing down the Mississippi River was seaborne and terrestrial, that is landborne forces, in support of one another to cut the Confederate States in two. The plan also called for a blockade of the Confederate coastline to cut the Confederate off from outside markets, and striking into the heartland of the Confederate States to bring them to heel. The plan was called the Anaconda Plan because it was supposed to strangle, it was supposed to constrict and choke the Confederate States, much the way the snake, the anaconda snake, does to its prey. Now, by his estimation, this plan will take about 3 years to do and take as many as 300,000 men to accomplish. He was very perceptive in looking at the war as a long-term, large-scale endeavor. Something that many of his contemporaries in 1861 did not contemplate. Now, Lincoln was under a time strain. He could not afford, in terms of political currency, to wage a war for 3 years. He was under pressure to make a dash for Richmond and end things quickly. The speed of the conclusion of the Mexican War loomed large in public opinion. There were people who said, there are more of us, we have better officers, these are, savages below us. End the war, make it quick. This resulted in Lincoln's push to get things done and quickly, and this resulted in the disastrous Battle of First Manassas, or Bull Run. Now, let me just make one clarification on this. During the United States Civil War, many battles were given dual names. That is, and this was common in warfare. Let me just say this too. This was common in warfare to give wars and battles different names depending on which nation or which side you were fighting on. The United States tended to name battles after geographic features. So it's the battle is referred to as Bull Run in the United States because Bull Run was a nearby creek. Most oftentimes you may hear it called the Battle of Bull Run Creek, but not very often, not very frequently. While the Confederate States tended to name battles after towns or geographic designations. So Manassas was the local rail line junction, and so that's why the Confederates call it Manassas. That's why it's still known as Bull Run or Manassas. And because the Confederates won the battle, people still call it Manassas because the Confederates won the battle. Although, and I'm rambling here, but it's either or. Bull Run, Manassas, same difference. The United States forces were commanded by General Irving McDowell, and McDowell had been given order to strike out at the Confederate States forces rendezvousing at Manassas. Now, McDowell had 35,000 men, and his opponent, Pierre Beauregard, had 20,000 men with reinforcements that were nearby. Now, the battle began on July 21st, 1861, with the two armies meeting in the first major land engagement of the United States Civil War. The United States Army was winning the day until a Confederate Army regiment under Thomas Jackson made a stand and turned the tide of battle. The Confederate Army then counterattacked the United States Army and swept the United States Army off the field, with the United States Army retreating rapidly towards Washington. Now, in the retreat, spectators who had come out from Washington to watch the battle were swept up in the disorderly street of the United States, and the roads back to Washington became choked with this sort of just bumbling mob, this stumbling, bumbling mob. Now, the Confederate Army was just as disorganized in victory and were unable to follow up their win. Now, the Confederate Army had won the first major battle of the war, and this seemed to be a portent of things to come. The casualties, I want to say as well, the casualties were huge for the time, with 2,000 Confederate States and 1,500 United States casualties. Up until this point, this was the bloodiest battle in the history of the United States. And now from there, I want to switch over to the Western theater. But let me just say this: in the aftermath of that battle, both sides sort of took a breather. There was this long, uneasy pause for a couple of months. And then the United States began to launch a series of offensive maneuvers. And they decided to apply pressure across the board in these maneuvers. They were attacking in the Eastern and the Western theater. And this is where the differences in leadership, the differences in command, sort of come into play that I spoke of earlier in our evaluation, our overall evaluation of the United States and Confederate States. And this right here will give you a prime example of what I was talking about. So, and just to clarify again, for the distinction for theaters, the war theaters are demarcated by the Appalachian Mountains, which dissect the Confederate States. So this huge interior obstacle, this huge interior geographical obstacle for the United States. In the Western theater, the United States armies were commanded by Henry Halleck, and Henry Halleck put in motion an offensive that sought to put into motion a portion of the Anaconda Plan that Winfield Scott had designed. Now, striking along the Mississippi River and into the heartland of the Tennessee, using the Tennessee and Cumberland Rivers, that was the portion of the plan that Halleck wanted to put into play. Halleck gave command to Ulysses S. Grant of the Tennessee element of his forces. Now, Grant was a West Pointer who had not had much success in his life outside of the military. Between February and March, Grant went on to capture key Confederate force and defensive positions. He was a shining star in the West, Grant was. And defensive positions leading to Nashville's capture. He just moseyed all the way down the rivers, breaking down all resistance that he encountered, and took Nashville, Tennessee. Grant then turned and headed towards Mississippi. Here, he was confronted by a Confederate army trying to launch a counterstrike against his advance. Now, the two armies met in the Mississippi-Tennessee backwoods at a spot called Shiloh or Pittsburgh Landing. Again, Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing. It reflects the different naming patterns of the United States and the Confederate States, but they are the exact same site. Here, on April 6th and April 7th, the two armies met. It was an enormous battle, and the tide really swung back and forth between the United States and the Confederate States. But in the end, the United States won the day and drove the Confederates back. And they drove them back in complete disorder, complete disarray. The casualty count was frightening for spectators. There were 11,000 Confederate dead and 13,000 United States casualties. More people died at Shiloh than in all previous wars in United States history. This will become a recurring theme or a recurring image for the United States Civil War. As the battles go on, the casualty list rises dramatically. Never before had the United States audiences been forced to witness such bloodletting. This was frightening for people. This was terrifying. Now the Confederate dead, the Confederates at this point just fell back. Shiloh was a complete victory for the United States. Things went even worse for the Confederates in the wake of Shiloh. Coming off of that initial success at Manassas, Bull Run, the Confederates expected to simply gain victory after victory. Well, Shiloh fell in bloody fashion, and then New Orleans was lost right after Shiloh. New Orleans was the largest city in the Confederate States, with over 100,000 residents. And more importantly, New Orleans was the mouth of the Mississippi River. It gave the United States Navy the opportunity to sail upriver, to sail up the Mississippi River. New Orleans was gone. The largest city, the largest population center in the Confederate States was gone, and control of the mouth of the Mississippi River was also gone, taken from the hands of the Confederate States. Now, and also on the heels of that, Memphis fell. So you had the Confederates losing three major cities very quickly in the western states. Memphis on the Mississippi River, Nashville in Tennessee, and New Orleans on the Gulf Coast. Those three population centers lost. Halleck and Grant at this point stood poised to do even more damage in the West. And again, those three things happened after only 6 months of campaigning in the West. And now to sort of caption that, to sort of balance that off and show you what I meant when I said there were even amount of good and bad commanders on both sides, we leave the Western Theater and we go to the Eastern Theater. So in the Eastern Theater, the United States offensive drive towards Richmond was failing. The United States commander, George B. McClellan, was a very ambitious man who was unwavering in his belief, his own personal belief, that he could single-handedly end the war. He moved his army by water, utilizing the great rivers of Eastern Virginia, and by early June of 1862, he had nearly made it to Richmond before being driven back in a series of battles against Robert E. Lee. And beginning in June, and going through June and July of 1862, Lee just outclassed McClellan. In the 7 days battle, Lee's army of Northern Virginia drove McClellan and his army, the Army of the Potomac, away from Richmond. Between June 25th and July 1st, they just drove them back at every turn, just hitting them. And casualties inflicted during the 7 days battles were even higher than at Shiloh, with 20,000 Confederate and 16,000 United States troops dead. So that's a combined 36,000 casualties for the 7 days battle, but it doesn't end there. Lee pursued the United States Army, and at this point, McClellan was recalled and brought back to Washington, and Lincoln and his cabinet sent out a man named John Pope. Pope was in command of the Army of the Potomac as they were making their way away from Richmond. He was in command when Lee came up, when Lee was pursuing them, and Lee came up, he pursued them, and he caught up with the Army of the Potomac and re-engaged with this army under John Pope on the old Manassas battlefield. Lee, with Thomas Jackson, once again, Thomas Jackson is playing a subordinate role to another commander, to another overall commander. But Lee came up at Manassas, at the Second Battle of Manassas, Second Bull Run, and inflicted a devastating defeat on the United States Army. He scored another critical victory for the Confederate States. The Second Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run, saw 25,000 total casualties, 16,000 United States casualties, 9,000 Confederate casualties. Pope retreated back to Washington with Lee at Manassas, poised to strike. Lee was victorious and he was poised to strike even further at the United States. Now, this was a major calamity for the United States. This was just as bad has the defeats at Nashville, the defeats at Memphis, and the loss of New Orleans. This was just as devastating for the United States had those losses had been for the Confederate States. Lee had restored morale. Pope, in the aftermath of the Battle of Second Manassas, was relieved of command and sent westward to Minnesota. He was simply, the joke is that the United States Army didn't want to bring the Corps commanders from the west to the east, but they were more than willing to send the subpar commanders from the east to the west. Pope is relieved. He spent the rest of the war in Minnesota battling against the Sioux, the Sioux tribe. McClellan was tapped once more to lead and command the Army of the Potomac. McClellan had a great ability for organizing an army, for serving in that type of capacity. But he was not a very strong battlefield commander, but a great military organizer. Now, McClellan restored morale and made preparations to guard against any future attacks from Lee, who were proved to be the most audacious commander of the United States Civil War. Now, this is how things stood in the summer of 1862, with Grant victorious in the West and Lee poised for even greater success in the East. And it is here where we will break, and we will come back to discuss what happened after Second Bull Run, Second Manassas. As always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and let me know what you guys thought about this lecture. And I'll see you guys next time.